Lord Alaric stood on the stone balcony of his manor, the cold evening air brushing against his face. The sun had long since set, leaving the world bathed in moonlight. Below him, the vast garden stretched out in every direction, an enchanting array of flowers and plants that seemed to hum with life. The faint scent of jasmine lingered in the air, and the rustling of leaves created a soft symphony of nature's whispers. Yet, despite the beauty surrounding him, Alaric felt nothing but emptiness. The past few years had drained him, stripping away any sense of joy he once found in his land. His wife had died long ago, and with her, any sense of purpose. He had thrown himself into his work, burying his sorrow in his studies and the upkeep of the estate. But tonight, something felt different. The emptiness in his chest seemed to ache more sharply. The solitude of the manor, once a comfort, now felt oppressive. His eyes lingered on the garden, knowing it held the one thing he could rely on, nature's beauty and the quiet companionship of his servant, Lyra. Lyra had been with him for nearly 2 years. She was unlike any servant he had known, her presence both gentle and commanding, as if she was more attuned to the rhythms of the world than anyone else. A demi-human with soft, golden fur that covered her limbs, and amber eyes that never quite seemed to meet his. Lyra was a mystery. She was quiet, never asking for more than what was required. Yet Alaric couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him more closely than she let on. There were times, in passing, when he would catch the faintest glimmer of something in her gaze, something almost longing. But tonight, as Alaric brooded on the balcony, it wasn't her presence that consumed him. It was the growing sense of desire, something raw and powerful, that he hadn't experienced in years. Something stirred deep within him, an attraction to the only person he saw every day, the only one who seemed to understand the solitude he kept. It wasn't just the beauty of her form or the way she moved through the house with such grace. It was the quiet intensity of her, the way she existed just slightly out of reach. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was Lyra. Her presence was unmistakable. "Lord Alaric," she spoke softly, her voice carrying a calm assurance that always seemed to settle him. She had a way of making him feel as though the weight of the world didn't matter, even if just for a moment. Alaric turned slowly to face her, his brow furrowing slightly. She was standing in the doorway, her figure framed by the faint light from inside. Her long, fox-like ears flicked slightly, and her eyes, though steady, carried an unreadable depth. "Lyra," he replied, his voice low. He wasn't sure why, but there was a tension in the air now, something palpable between them. She had never approached him like this before, not with the same quiet intensity. She stepped closer, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them seemed to hum with an undercurrent of something neither could fully acknowledge. Alaric couldn't remember when things had begun to shift between them, when the polite distance they maintained had started to fray at the edges. It had been gradual, but now it felt inevitable, as though they were both standing on the precipice of something neither of them was willing to confront. Finally, it was Lyra who broke the silence. I have something to ask you, my lord," she said, her gaze not meeting his. She shifted nervously, her fingers brushing against the folds of her simple maid's dress. Alaric raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Go on." Lyra hesitated for a moment, as though weighing her words carefully. "It's an old custom, one I learned from my family," she began. "A ritual, I suppose you would call it, to help connect two souls. It's done through touch, through physical connection." Alaric's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure why her words affected him so, but they did. Something in her tone, something in the way she said, "physical connection," made his pulse quicken. He had never seen Lyra look this vulnerable. His gaze softened, and he took a slow step toward her, a frown furrowing his brow. "What kind of ritual?" His voice was low, though the question held more curiosity than concern. "It's not just physical," Lyra replied, her voice softer now. "It involves sharing a part of yourself with the other person, a kind of bond. It's meant to strengthen the connection, to allow you to understand one another on a deeper level. But it's a very personal thing, and it requires trust. Alaric stared at her for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. There was something in the way she spoke, something that suggested the ritual wasn't just about magic or connection, it was about something more, something intimate. A chill ran down his spine. He could feel the tension thickening in the air between them, wrapping around them like a tightrope. He wasn't sure what to say, but his curiosity, that insistent, gnawing curiosity, urged him to continue listening. "I'm not sure I understand," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't meant to let slip. Lyra glanced up at him then, her amber eyes meeting his for the first time with an intensity that took him aback. There was something in her gaze, something unspoken, that made his breath catch. She stood taller now, no longer the quiet, submissive servant, but something more, someone who held her own quiet power. "You don't have to understand, my lord," she said quietly, "but it's something I believe might help us both." Alaric felt a knot form in his stomach. There was no mistaking the invitation in her words. He swallowed hard, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The tension between them had reached its peak. A delicate thread stretched thin. "I see," he said slowly, his voice softer now, barely above a whisper. Lyra took a deep breath, her gaze falling to the ground for a moment. "It's just a suggestion," she added, her voice almost too quiet to hear. "You don't have to accept it." The world seemed to hold its breath. Alaric's mind raced, but in the end, the only thing he could focus on was the look in her eyes, the invitation, the promise. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "I'll consider it." Lyra nodded, her ears flicking nervously, and for the first time in a long while, Alaric felt a flicker of something more than emptiness, something dangerous, something beautiful. As the night stretched on, the moonlight bathed them both in an ethereal glow, and for just a moment, they stood together, the weight of the world forgotten. The stage was set for a journey neither of them could anticipate, a path that would lead them both down a road filled with unspoken desires and intimate revelations. The days following their conversation had been oddly tense, charged with an energy neither Alaric nor Lyra could ignore. Alaric found it hard to focus on anything other than the words she had spoken. A ritual of touch, she had called it, and though he tried to push it from his mind, the thought lingered, like an insistent whisper he couldn't quite shake. Every time Lyra entered a room, every time their eyes briefly met, something pulled at him. She had offered him a chance to explore something deeper, something beyond the confines of their usual relationship. But what exactly had she meant? Was this ritual a mere formality of trust, or was it something far more intimate? Something that could change everything between them? It was late afternoon when Alaric found himself standing in the garden again, as he had so many times before. The world was beginning to cool as the sun sank lower, the air tinged with the scent of damp earth and blooming roses. His gaze swept over the manicured paths, his thoughts lingering on Lyra, who was not far behind. She had been unusually quiet today, not offering her usual soft words as she moved through her tasks. Alaric heard the light sound of her footsteps before he saw her, the soft rustle of her dress against the grass as she walked toward him. She appeared at the edge of the garden, her silhouette framed by the fading sunlight. The light caught the golden fur on her ears and the nape of her neck, casting a soft glow around her. She was striking, undeniably so. It was something Alaric had always known, but recently, it felt as though his awareness of her beauty had shifted into something more profound. "Lyra," Alaric called softly, his voice carrying through the evening stillness. She looked up at him, her amber eyes catching the last remnants of the sun's warmth. For a moment, she said nothing, simply meeting his gaze. He noticed the way her fingers gripped the fabric of her apron, the subtle tension in her posture. She was nervous, there was no mistaking it. "You wanted to speak with me again, didn't you?" Alaric asked, taking a step toward her. The tension between them was palpable now, and it seemed impossible to ignore. Lyra's ears twitched slightly, and she hesitated for a moment longer before speaking, her voice soft but steady. Yes, my lord. I wanted to ask if you were ready, if you'd consider the ritual. Alaric studied her. The way she stood there before him, vulnerable but resolute. There was something undeniably magnetic about her. A quiet confidence in her words that contradicted the nervousness she tried to hide. For a moment he said nothing. His mind raced, torn between his desire to remain distant and the undeniable pull toward her. The ritual, he repeated, his voice low. You still believe in it, then? Lyra nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. I do, my lord. It is said to bring clarity, a deeper understanding of one another. Her voice dropped even lower, almost a whisper. It can help us understand what we cannot see with our eyes alone. Alaric felt a strange tug in his chest. There was something in her words, something he couldn't quite grasp, but it felt important, too important to dismiss. He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path. And what would we do in this ritual? He asked, the curiosity now evident in his voice. Lyra glanced away for a brief moment, as though gathering her thoughts, before meeting his gaze again. We share a simple touch, nothing more than that. It is the beginning. It is about connecting on a deeper level through touch and presence. It is a way of sharing energy, if you will. Alaric's heart beat a little faster. Touch. The word echoed in his mind, and he felt his pulse quicken in response. Lyra's presence had always been calming, distant yet somehow soothing. But now, as she stood before him, there was an undercurrent of something else. Something electric. Something that made his skin feel warm in the cool evening air. And if we continue the ritual? He asked, his voice now laced with uncertainty. He didn't know what answer he hoped for. Part of him was afraid of what might happen if they went further. And yet, another part of him longed for something more than mere words or formalities. Lyra hesitated again, her eyes momentarily darting downward. She looked almost vulnerable in that instant, something Alaric had rarely seen. It was as if she was giving him a piece of herself, trusting him to understand. If we continue, she said softly, it could bring us closer, much closer than before. It is a step, my lord, but it must be taken with care, with mutual respect. Neither of us should push the other. Her words were both reassuring and filled with the kind of weight that made Alaric feel as though he stood at the edge of a precipice. There was no going back from this. If they chose to proceed, it would change everything. Alaric took a deep breath. He had spent years keeping his emotions locked away, but now, something inside him felt like it was about to break free. He looked at Lyra, standing there so close and yet so far away. Her presence filled the space between them, pulling him toward her in a way he hadn't expected. I think I understand, he murmured, his voice more vulnerable than he'd intended. And I think I'm ready, if you are. Lyra's eyes widened slightly, a faint blush spreading across her cheeks. She nodded, her lips parting as if to say something more, but she said nothing. The air around them thickened, and the moment stretched on, stretching the already palpable tension between them. Shall we begin? Lyra's voice was barely above a whisper, and she stepped forward, closing the final gap between them. Her proximity seemed to make the world go quiet. Alaric's senses heightened, every detail, her scent, the faint rustle of her fur, the softness of her breath, felt magnified. Alaric felt the pull, the desire to reach out and close the distance. But something held him back, as if part of him was waiting for a sign, for confirmation that this was the right decision. Lyra seemed to sense this hesitation, and she offered a small, reassuring smile, though it was filled with a quiet uncertainty. Without another word, she reached out, her hand hovering just inches from his, as if asking for his permission. Her eyes met his, steady and searching, and in that moment Alaric knew. He nodded slowly, giving her the sign she needed, and together, they allowed the first touch of their connection to begin. The moment their hands met, Alaric felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but as Lyra's fingers lightly brushed against his, it grew stronger, flooding his senses with an unfamiliar heat. He could feel her pulse, steady and calm, beneath her soft skin. There was a hum of something alive in the air, as though their touch was stirring the very fabric of the space around them. Alaric had never experienced anything quite like it. Lyra's hand was gentle, yet it carried an undeniable weight, an invitation. The touch was tender, but it held a deeper meaning, something Alaric could not quite define. As they stood there, holding each other's gaze, a silence stretched between them, thick and almost tangible. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The connection between them was growing stronger with each passing second. Alaric's heart beat faster, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the emotions swirling inside him. His hand, still holding Lyra's, felt as if it were no longer his own. Her warmth seemed to seep into him, filling the empty spaces inside. She was close now, much closer than before, and the air between them felt charged, electric. Lyra's eyes flickered down to their joined hands, and then slowly, almost cautiously, she stepped a little closer. Her breath was shallow, as if she were unsure of herself in that moment. For a fleeting second, Alaric wanted to pull away, to break the connection before things could go any further. But something in Lyra's expression, something in the way she held herself, stopped him. She wasn't asking for more than what had been promised. She was simply asking him to take the next step. Her fingers curled more firmly around his, a silent request for him to match her intensity. He complied, tightening his grip just slightly. The warmth between them deepened, and Alaric could feel the pulse of her hand, her energy, flowing into him, mingling with his own. It was an intimacy he hadn't anticipated, a shared bond that was more than mere touch. Lyra's gaze lifted to meet his once more, and in her eyes, Alaric saw a flicker of something raw, something vulnerable. She wasn't hiding behind the quiet, composed mask she had worn so often. In this moment, she was completely open, and it was more than Alaric had ever expected. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, his voice a whisper, as if the very sound of his words might disrupt the fragile moment between them. Lyra took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. "Now," she said, her voice soft but steady, "we begin to understand each other. We share our presence, our energy. It is not just touch, it is allowing each other to feel, to know." She paused, looking at him with a look that was almost too intense to bear. "It's about trust." Alaric swallowed, his throat dry as he nodded. Trust. It was a word that had been on his mind constantly since their conversation days before. He had trusted few people in his life, and never in such a deep, unspoken way. But as he looked at Lyra, the sincerity in her eyes made him want to believe her, want to trust her. The air around them seemed to thicken, the distance between them shrinking as Lyra slowly lifted her other hand. She placed it lightly on his chest, over his heart. The gesture was gentle, almost tentative, but it sent a shock wave of warmth through him. Her fingers were cool against his skin, but the weight of her touch was comforting, familiar, as though it belonged there. Alaric's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he was lost in the sensation of her presence. Her touch was soft, yet it held an undeniable intensity, as though she were reaching into him, through him. He could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat in his chest, and as Lyra's palm rested there, he could almost sense her listening to it, as if she could hear the pulse of his emotions. He should have felt uncomfortable, should have pulled away, but instead, he stood there, frozen, allowing her to guide the moment. He wanted to understand, wanted to explore the strange connection that had begun between them. And as his eyes met hers, he could see the same questions reflected in her gaze. Slowly, with deliberate care, Lyra moved her hand upward, tracing the line of his collarbone with the tips of her fingers. The touch was light, almost feather-like, but it stirred something in Alaric. A flutter of sensation, a deep ache that started in his chest and traveled down to the pit of his stomach. Her touch, though soft, felt like a declaration, a promise that both intrigued and unsettled him. "Are you comfortable?" she asked, her voice barely a murmur. Alaric nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, More than I expected. His voice was rougher than he intended, his breath shallow, as if the air around them had thickened and made it harder to breathe. I didn't know what to expect, but, but it's not what you thought it would be, Lyra finished for him, her voice laced with a knowing quality. Alaric's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time since their conversation, he realized just how much he wanted this. Wanted to understand, wanted to explore what lay beyond the surface of their usual exchanges. He didn't know how far they would go, but in that moment all he wanted was to stay in the present, to stay here with her. I never expected it to feel this way, he admitted, his voice softer now, more vulnerable than he had intended. His hand, still clasped around hers, tightened just a fraction. It was a subtle gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Lyra's lips parted slightly, and she seemed to hesitate, as though considering something. She pulled her hand back from his chest, but not far, just enough to rest it gently on his shoulder. The movement was deliberate, as though testing the waters, seeking his reaction. Alaric remained still, his breath slow and measured as he waited, allowing her the space to move, to decide what came next. The night air swirled around them, carrying the faint scent of roses, the soft rustle of leaves in the distance. The world felt suspended in that moment, as though nothing existed beyond the space they occupied together. Lyra's hand remained on his shoulder for a few moments longer, her touch a grounding force. And then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned in, her forehead brushing against his. The touch was light, almost like a question, and Alaric could feel the quiet uncertainty in the gesture. Without thinking, he mirrored her action, his forehead resting against hers. The simple contact sent a shock of warmth through him, and he felt a rush of emotion, something tender, something raw. And for the first time in their shared silence, they both understood. This moment, fragile as it was, had crossed a threshold. Neither could predict what would come next, but both knew they were no longer standing on the edge. Their hearts were beginning to beat in unison. The following days seemed to pass in a blur. Alaric found himself preoccupied with the events of that evening, unable to shake the feeling of Lyra's presence lingering in his mind. The touch, the warmth, the unspoken understanding between them. It was as if something had shifted, and though neither of them had said as much, there was an undeniable change in the air. The house, once quiet and routine, now felt charged, the spaces between them charged with the weight of what had passed. They had not spoken of it since that moment in the garden. Lyra returned to her usual duties, tending to the household with the same grace and efficiency she always did, but Alaric could sense a shift. There was a subtle tension when their paths crossed, when she moved past him, when he entered a room she was in. It was like an invisible thread pulling them closer, though neither of them dared to acknowledge it directly. Alaric had always prided himself on his control, his ability to maintain composure even in the most difficult of circumstances. But now, as he watched Lyra move about the house, something inside him stirred. A feeling he hadn't known in years, if ever at all. His thoughts wandered to the touch they had shared, how it had felt, how it had shaken something deep within him. She had offered him a glimpse of something raw, something vulnerable, and he couldn't help but wonder what more there was beneath the surface. One morning, after breakfast, Alaric found himself in his study, sitting at his desk, papers spread before him in a futile attempt to focus on his work. The soft sound of footsteps approaching interrupted his thoughts, and he looked up, meeting Lyra's gaze. She stood in the doorway, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture a perfect balance of strength and grace. "My lord," she said, her voice carrying the usual quiet respect, though there was something softer in it now, something he hadn't noticed before. "There is a task I must attend to in the garden. Would you like company?" The question was casual enough, but the way she spoke it made Alaric pause. There was something in her tone that suggested she was looking for something more than just his permission to accompany her. Her eyes held his for a moment longer than usual, the silent invitation clear between them. Alaric considered her offer. The routine of his day had been disrupted by the constant thoughts of Lyra and the growing tension between them, and the idea of stepping away from the walls of his study seemed oddly appealing. Perhaps he could clear his mind, step outside, and allow himself a moment to breathe. "Very well," he replied, his voice quieter than he intended. He stood from his desk, pushing the papers aside. "Let us go then." They walked together in silence, the path to the garden stretching before them. Alaric could feel the subtle pull between them, the quiet understanding that had formed in their brief, shared moments. Lyra was not saying much, but her presence seemed to speak volumes. She moved with a quiet grace, as if every step was deliberate, every gesture measured. When they reached the garden, Lyra moved toward the far corner where the flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, her hands gently brushing against the petals as she worked. Alaric stood back for a moment, watching her. The sun filtered through the trees, casting a soft, golden light over her as she moved, her movements fluid and almost hypnotic. There was something about the way she interacted with the world, with the earth itself, that made him pause. It was as if she were in tune with something deeper, something beyond what was visible. After a few moments, she turned toward him, her expression neutral, though there was something in the way she looked at him that made Alaric's pulse quicken. "I've been thinking," Lyra began, her voice soft but steady, "about our conversation, about the ritual. I wanted to ask if you still feel comfortable, if you still wish to continue." The question caught Alaric off guard, though he knew it was something that had been hanging in the air between them ever since that first touch. He had felt the shift, the way things had changed, and though he hadn't vocalized it, there was no denying that the moment they shared had stirred something in him. I do," he said, his voice low. "I want to understand, to explore it further. I haven't felt like this before. It's hard to put into words." Lyra nodded, as though she had expected this answer. She didn't seem surprised, but there was a softness in her gaze that made Alaric feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to. "I know," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "It's difficult to explain, but that's the way of it. The deeper connection comes with time, with trust. The ritual isn't just about touch. It's about allowing ourselves to be open to something more, to something we can't yet name." Alaric took a step closer, his heart racing. It felt strange, this openness, this willingness to allow himself to be vulnerable. But the pull he felt toward Lyra, the desire to understand this connection, was too strong to ignore. "I want to trust you," he said, his voice quieter now, "and I want to trust myself in this." Lyra's lips parted as if to say something more, but she seemed to pause, unsure. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, the air around them seemed to thicken, charged with the unspoken words between them. She stepped closer, her presence filling the space between them, her gaze searching his. "You already do," she whispered, her voice gentle but certain. And in that moment, Alaric realized that this was the beginning, the first step into something deeper, something more than he had ever allowed himself to experience before. He didn't know where it would lead, but he felt certain that whatever happened next, they would face it together. Lyra moved even closer, so close that Alaric could feel the heat of her body against his. She raised her hand, placing it on his chest once more, the touch light but firm. The warmth of her hand sent a ripple through him, and he couldn't help but hold his breath as the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, standing there in the garden, connected by a bond neither of them fully understood. Alaric reached out, his hand hovering just above her shoulder, unsure of what he should do next. His fingers trembled slightly, the closeness between them almost overwhelming. But before he could make the decision, Lyra's eyes softened, and she gave him a small, encouraging nod. And with that, Alaric took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The moment, fragile as it was, held the promise of something more. He didn't know where it would take them, but for the first time he was ready to find out. The ritual was beginning to unfold, and neither of them could turn back. The days that followed were marked by an unspoken tension that hung between Alaric and Lyra. It was the kind of tension that made every moment shared between them feel weighted, yet intimate, like the quiet before a storm. There was no rush, no pushing. Everything moved slowly, deliberately, as if both of them were carefully testing the waters, unwilling to make any move that could break the fragile balance they had created. Each day, their interactions grew more charged, though neither of them dared to speak about it. They spent time together in the garden, walked silently through the estate, and even shared meals in a quiet, companionable manner. Lyra's presence was always soothing, but now, there was something more. Alaric noticed how the smallest touch, her hand brushing against his when handing him a cup, the soft brush of her arm as she passed by, seemed to linger longer than it ever had before. And each time it happened, his pulse would quicken, his thoughts scattering. But they had not gone further than that first touch in the garden. Not yet. And still, the question lingered between them. Would they? Should they? It was late one evening when the answer came. Alaric had returned from a long day of meetings, his mind fatigued from the constant demands of his responsibilities. He had hoped for peace, for silence. But as he made his way down the hall toward his study, he saw Lyra standing by the open door, her back to him as she looked out into the courtyard beyond. The soft light from the moon cast a gentle glow over her, making her seem almost ethereal, as if she belonged to the night itself. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should approach, but something in the stillness of the room called to him. Slowly, he moved toward her, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. Lyra did not turn to acknowledge him, but her body seemed to tense the moment he stepped into the room. She didn't need to speak for him to know she was aware of his presence. And yet, there was something in the way she held herself, something vulnerable, something unfamiliar, that made Alaric pause. He stepped closer, coming to a stop beside her. The quiet stretched between them, thick with the weight of everything unspoken. "It's beautiful tonight," Lyra said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was almost a whisper, as though she were afraid to disturb the peace that enveloped them. Alaric glanced out toward the courtyard. The night sky was clear, the stars twinkling like diamonds in the expanse above. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the trees, carrying the scent of jasmine and earth. It was a peaceful moment, but it felt different now, somehow. It felt like something was shifting, like they were on the edge of something that neither of them could control. "It is," Alaric replied, his voice quieter than usual. He looked down at her, noting the way the soft moonlight highlighted the curves of her face, the way her hair seemed to shimmer in the dim light. There was a softness to her now, a quiet strength that he hadn't noticed before. It made his chest tighten, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if it was the weight of the night or the weight of his own emotions. Lyra turned slightly to face him, her eyes meeting his. She was so close now that he could see the small flecks of silver in the depths of her gaze, the way her pupils dilated slightly in the low light. Her breath was shallow, and her lips parted as if she wanted to say something more, but no words came. Instead, she took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Alaric felt his breath catch in his throat as she came closer, her presence overwhelming in a way that was both familiar and entirely new. There was a quiet intensity in her movements, a certainty that took him by surprise. She was offering him something, something beyond what either of them had expected, and for the first time since this strange connection had begun, Alaric felt like he couldn't hold back any longer. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted it to touch her cheek. The warmth of her skin beneath his fingers sent a shock through him, making his pulse race. She didn't pull away, didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her breath soft and steady. "Lyra." Alaric's voice was low, rough with something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge until now. "What are we doing?" Lyra's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, as though collecting her thoughts before responding. When she opened them again, there was a depth in her gaze, an openness that made Alaric's heart race. "We're finding each other," she said, her voice almost a breath. "Finding what this is, what we are, together." Alaric's breath hitched, and for a moment, he wasn't sure what to say. The words seemed insufficient to express the depth of what he felt, the way his body ached to understand this connection between them. There were no easy answers, no simple explanations. All he knew was that the pull toward her was undeniable, and the longing inside him was becoming impossible to ignore. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice strained. I don't know what to do next. Lyra gave a small, knowing smile, one that spoke of understanding without words. She reached up to gently touch his hand, guiding it from her cheek to the curve of her neck. Alaric felt her pulse beneath his fingers, the steady rhythm that matched his own. You don't have to know, she whispered. You just have to trust. Her words hung in the air between them, a promise and a plea all at once. It was then that Alaric realized how much he had been holding back, how much he had been afraid of losing control. But here, with her, in this moment, he felt a strange calm wash over him. He didn't need to know where this would lead. All that mattered was that he trusted her, and trusted himself enough to follow where it might go. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he leaned in, closing the gap between them. The air seemed to crackle with the electricity of the moment as their lips met in a gentle, tentative kiss. It was soft at first, barely a whisper of contact. But as the kiss deepened, a flood of emotions rushed through him. Desire, longing, and a fierce sense of connection. They pulled away after a moment, breathless, both of them searching each other's eyes for something they had not yet found. Neither spoke for a long moment, the silence heavy but not uncomfortable. The kiss had answered something unspoken between them, but Alaric knew there was more to come. Lyra's hand rested lightly on his chest, and she gave a soft, almost imperceptible nod. We're ready, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the intensity of the moment. Alaric's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of her words settling in his mind. There was no turning back now. The ritual, the connection, they were no longer just an idea. They were a reality, one they would navigate together. The night stretched out before them, full of possibilities, but also the unknown, and neither of them was quite ready to face what came next. The morning sun was barely a whisper on the horizon when Alaric awoke. He lay still, his mind swirling with the events of the previous night, the kiss that had left his heart racing, the tender moments that had felt both foreign and familiar. The connection between him and Lyra had deepened in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had started as a quiet curiosity had evolved into something more, something raw, yet fragile, as if a single misstep could shatter the delicate balance they had begun to forge. It wasn't just the kiss that lingered in his mind. It was the promise in Lyra's eyes, the understanding that passed between them. There was a weight to it, a responsibility that he hadn't quite grasped. He had never been the type to rush into things without thinking, but now, with Lyra standing so close, the air thick with something unsaid, he felt the urge to move forward, to explore whatever this was between them. But fear lingered. What would happen if they crossed the line? Would everything change? He rose from the bed and dressed quickly, pushing those thoughts aside. Today, like every other day, required his attention. There were meetings, reports, and tasks that demanded his focus. But the back of his mind remained occupied with the memory of Lyra's touch, of how she had guided him with such trust, as if she had known exactly what he needed before he even realized it himself. When Alaric entered the dining hall for breakfast, the familiar scent of fresh bread and brewing tea filled the air, but it did little to settle the tension in his chest. Lyra was already there, her back to him as she prepared the table. Her movements were graceful, almost automatic, as though she were immersed in the routine of her work. But there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. Her shoulders were slightly tense, and when she turned to face him, her eyes met his with a quiet wariness that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, my lord," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of something more, something deeper. "Good morning, Lyra," Alaric replied, his voice softer than usual. He took his seat, watching her closely as she set the last of the plates down. The silence between them felt thicker today, as if both of them were waiting for something, waiting for the other to make a move, to say the words that hovered in the air. Lyra paused before sitting down, her fingers lightly brushing over the edge of the table, as if finding something to steady herself. "I wanted to talk," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "About last night." Alaric's heart skipped a beat. There it was, the conversation they had both been avoiding, the one that would decide what came next. The tension that had simmered between them was now tangible, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. I don't regret it, she continued, her eyes focused on the table. But I don't want either of us to do something we're not ready for. This connection, it's new. For both of us. Alaric sat back, his fingers wrapped around his cup as he considered her words. He had known it would be delicate, but hearing her voice, the concern that had been in his mind made everything feel even more fragile. I don't want to rush either, he said, his voice low, steady. But I can't deny that I feel something I've never felt before. With you. Lyra's gaze lifted then, locking onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before, a quiet strength mixed with uncertainty. It was as if she, too, was standing on the edge of something unknown. I feel it too, she whispered. But this, what we have, it's not just about desire, it's about trust. We have to trust each other fully before we move forward. Can't be something fleeting, can't just be the touch or the kiss. It has to be everything. Alaric nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in his chest. It was more than he had expected, more than he had understood. Trust, that was the key. Not just the physical moments, but the moments when they shared the deepest parts of themselves, the parts that were hidden behind their roles, their identities. I'm willing to trust you, Alaric said quietly, his voice carrying the sincerity he felt. But I need you to trust me too, and I need to understand what it is we're doing, what it means. Lyra looked down for a moment, her fingers moving restlessly across the tablecloth. Then, with a deep breath, she met his gaze again. I know, she said, it's a lot to ask, but I think we both need to be honest with each other about what we want, what we're willing to give. The room felt charged, the air thick with the unspoken words between them. Alaric could see it in her eyes, the hesitation, the fear, but also the desire to move forward, to find out what lay beyond the surface. And he realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that he wanted the same thing. He wanted to explore this connection, but only if they could do it together with no doubts, no walls between them. I don't want to push you, Alaric said, his voice softening, but I think we're both ready for something more. Not just the rituals, not just the kisses, but the trust that comes with it. Lyra's expression softened, and she took a slow step closer, her hand resting lightly on the edge of his. Then let's take that step together, she said quietly. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the decision settling around them. Neither of them knew what the future held, but in that moment, they both understood that they were willing to face it side by side. The rest of the day passed in a haze, the normal routine of the estate blurring into the background as Alaric's thoughts remained fixed on Lyra, on the choice they had made together. The uncertainty still lingered, but it was tempered by something more. A quiet hope, a promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alaric found himself standing in the courtyard, waiting. He had made the decision. Now it was time to see where this path would lead. He didn't have to wait long. Lyra appeared, moving gracefully through the garden, her figure silhouetted against the fading light. She stopped in front of him, her eyes searching his face, as though asking if he was certain. Alaric nodded, his heart steady in his chest. I'm certain, he said quietly, and in that moment, the last of their hesitation fell away. They were no longer just two people bound by circumstance, they were something more, something they had built step by step with trust and vulnerability. The next step, whatever it may be, was theirs to take, together. The days following their conversation were quieter than either of them had expected. There was a sense of peace between Alaric and Lyra, but also a lingering anticipation, as if they were both waiting for something. The kind of waiting that made every small gesture feel significant, as if each touch, each glance, carried a deeper meaning. It was a Saturday afternoon when the next shift came, when the tension that had been building between them finally began to unravel. Alaric had spent the morning working in his study, his thoughts divided between his responsibilities and the quiet presence of Lyra in the house. He could hear her movements from the hallway, soft steps, the rustle of cloth, the faint sound of humming as she worked in the kitchens. There was something comforting about it, about the way she moved through the house as if it was a part of her. He set down his pen, his thoughts drifting back to the conversation they had shared. Trust. He could feel it between them now like a thread that connected them, keeping them grounded. But there was something more, something unspoken that they both felt. A question that hung in the air, not yet answered. Where would this path lead them? He stood up, stretching his tired muscles, and walked to the door. There was no reason to stay in his study when Lyra was near. He needed to see her to understand where they were heading. When Alaric entered the hallway, he found her standing by the window, gazing out at the garden. The soft light from the late afternoon sun bathed her in a warm glow, making her look even more ethereal than usual. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a certain tension in the set of her shoulders, as if she were deep in thought. "Lyra," Alaric called gently, his voice low but warm. She turned at the sound of his voice, and for a moment, their gazes locked. There was something unspoken between them, an understanding that neither could quite put into words. Her lips parted, but she said nothing at first. Instead, she walked toward him, her movements fluid, as if she were moving towards something inevitable. "You're not working today?" she asked, her voice soft, almost teasing. "I needed a break," he replied with a small smile. "Besides, I thought I'd see what you were up to." Lyra raised an eyebrow, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "I'm sure I can find something for you to do," she said with a playful tone. Alaric chuckled, feeling a lightness in his chest. She had always had a way of making him smile, even in the most trying of times. There was something magnetic about her presence, something that drew him in even when he tried to keep his distance. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers as he took a step closer. The contact was simple, but it sent a jolt of warmth through him. Lyra didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand rest in his for a moment, her touch gentle but deliberate. "I don't think you need to find work for me," Alaric said, his voice lowering. "I think I've already found what I need." Lyra's expression softened, and she gave a small nod. "What's that?" "You," he said simply, his words sincere. "I think I've been looking for you longer than I realized." The words hung between them, and for a moment, neither spoke. There was a vulnerability in that silence, a quiet honesty that neither of them had dared express before. Alaric's heart raced, the pulse in his throat hammering as he watched her. It was a strange feeling, knowing that something so simple, something as simple as her touch, could affect him so deeply. "Alaric," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to rush things, but I can't keep pretending that everything's the same between us. Not anymore." Her words settled over him like a weight, and his chest tightened. He had known, of course, that things couldn't stay the same. There had been too much change, too much building between them for them to pretend they were still in the same place they had been when they first met. They had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. "I don't want to rush either," Alaric replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want to hold back anymore either." Lyra's eyes softened, and she took another step closer, the air between them crackling with unspoken understanding. There was no more distance between them, no more walls. Everything had been laid bare, and now there was only the path forward. "I trust you," Lyra said, her words quiet but resolute. "I trust you enough to take this next step." Alaric felt his heart swell at her words. He had been afraid of what would happen if they took this next step, afraid of what it would mean for them. But hearing her say it, hearing the trust in her voice, made everything feel clearer. He stepped closer, his hand reaching to cup her cheek, and she leaned into his touch. "I trust you too," he whispered. The distance between them was gone now, their bodies close, their breaths mingling in the quiet of the room. There was no more need for words, no more need to question or doubt. The silence between them was filled with the weight of their shared understanding, their shared desire. And then, without another word, Alaric leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a soft, slow kiss. It was different this time, deeper, filled with the promise of something more. Lyra's hand rested against his chest, and he could feel the beat of her heart beneath her fingertips, steady and sure. The kiss was a slow exploration, a dance of trust and vulnerability. It wasn't hurried, wasn't rushed. It was a moment to savor, a moment to build on. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless, their faces inches apart, their gazes locked. Lyra smiled, a soft, quiet smile that spoke volumes, and Alaric couldn't help but smile back. "This is the beginning," he said softly, his voice low but filled with certainty. Lyra nodded, her eyes shining with something that mirrored his own feelings. "Yes," she agreed, "it's the beginning of everything." They stood there for a moment longer, the world outside fading into the background as they held onto the connection they had found. The path ahead wasn't clear, but it didn't matter. They had taken the first step, and for now that was enough. As they pulled away, Lyra reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his as she looked up at him with a quiet determination. "Let's see where this leads," she said, her voice firm but filled with warmth. Alaric squeezed her hand, feeling a quiet thrill run through him. They didn't need to know exactly where this path would go. Not yet. All they needed was the trust they had built, the bond they had shared, and the willingness to face whatever came next, together. And together they would face it. The next few days passed in a blur for Alaric and Lyra. A strange sort of peace had settled between them, the kind that comes after a shared moment of understanding, when both parties realize that something important has shifted, but they are not yet ready to name it. They were closer now, physically, emotionally, but neither spoke of what had transpired between them, nor of where it was leading. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was just an unspoken agreement that they would let things unfold naturally. Alaric still spent long hours in his study, lost in his work, but his thoughts were never far from Lyra. He found himself stealing glances at her when she moved through the house, her delicate, graceful movements, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. There was an air of independence about her, one that made his chest tighten with both admiration and protectiveness. It was clear to him now that their bond had become something deeper, something far more intricate than the simple master-servant relationship they had once shared. There were moments when they would catch each other's gaze across the room, and for a fleeting instant, everything else would fade away. His heart would race, and her lips would curl into a subtle smile, the kind that held 1,000 words. Lyra, for her part, was more introspective than usual. Alaric had noticed the way she would linger a little longer in the doorway when she entered his study, the way her eyes would flicker with something she didn't say. She had always been good at keeping her emotions close to the chest, but he had learned to read her small tells, the way she fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve when she was nervous, or the way her eyes softened when she was deep in thought. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, Alaric found himself wandering the halls of his home, searching for something to occupy his mind. He had been restless all afternoon, distracted by thoughts of Lyra, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house became quiet and still. It was in this quiet solitude that he found himself outside the door to the library. Inside, Lyra was sitting at the desk, a book open before her, but it was clear she wasn't reading. Her mind was elsewhere. He stood there for a moment, watching her, unsure of what to do next. He had gotten used to the closeness between them, but tonight something felt different. The space between them seemed heavier, the air thicker with unspoken thoughts. "Lyra?" he said softly, pushing the door open just a crack. She looked up, her eyes bright with surprise, though the tension in her shoulders relaxed when she saw him. "Alaric," she greeted, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite place. He stepped into the room, the door closing softly behind him. The library, usually filled with the scent of old leather-bound books, seemed unusually still tonight. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Alaric began, his tone quiet. He paused, taking a step closer. I wanted to check on you." Lyra smiled faintly. "I'm fine," she said, her eyes holding his for a moment longer than necessary. "Just thinking." He raised an eyebrow, the curiosity in him piqued. About what? She hesitated, and for a moment, he thought she might pull away, retreat into her usual guarded silence. But then she sighed, setting the book aside and meeting his gaze with a quiet intensity. About us, she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Alaric's heart skipped a beat. There it was, the unspoken question that had been hanging between them, the one neither of them had dared to vocalize. The tension that had been building ever since that night, when they had crossed a line neither of them had anticipated. I don't know what this is, Lyra continued, her voice still calm but carrying an edge of uncertainty. But I can feel it. I can feel it every time I'm near you, every time our hands touch, every time our eyes meet. It's different. Alaric swallowed hard, stepping closer to her, his heart racing. I feel it too, he said, his voice low and earnest. But I don't know what it means yet. I don't know what to do with it. For a moment, there was a long silence between them, the kind that was thick with the weight of things unspoken. Alaric could see the way her chest rose and fell with each breath, the slight trembling of her hands as she placed them on the desk. She was as uncertain as he was, and yet there was something about her, something about the way she carried herself, that made him want to reach out to close the distance between them. He took another step closer, his fingers brushing against the back of her chair. You don't have to figure it out right now, he said softly, his voice filled with understanding. We don't have to have all the answers. But I don't want to lose this, whatever this is. Lyra's gaze softened, and for the first time in days, Alaric saw her vulnerability, her uncertainty mirrored in his own eyes. There was no need for words between them now, not when everything was laid bare. The trust they had built over time was a foundation they could stand on, even if the future felt uncertain. You're right, she whispered. We don't have to figure it all out. Not yet. Alaric took a deep breath, his hand reaching out, tentative at first, but then more sure as he rested it gently on her shoulder. I just want to be close to you, he confessed, his voice raw with emotion. Lyra didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her head tilting slightly to the side, as if she were savoring the connection between them. I want that too, she murmured. More than I've wanted anything in a long time. The air between them shifted, the tension slowly unraveling as they stood in the soft glow of the firelight. Alaric's fingers brushed against her skin, a gentle touch that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't the first time they had touched, but it felt different now. There was an intimacy in it, a shared understanding that neither of them could deny. Their bodies were close, but it was their hearts, their souls, that seemed to be drawing nearer. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet longing, and Alaric felt his chest tighten in response. He had wanted this, wanted her, for so long, and yet he was afraid of what it might mean. But when he saw the trust in her eyes, the same trust that had been building between them for days, he knew that it was time to let go of his fears. You're not alone in this, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Not anymore. Lyra nodded, her lips curving into a small but meaningful smile. The world outside seemed to disappear as they stood there, their hearts beating in sync, their bodies closer than they had ever been. For a long moment they stayed like that, not speaking, just being. And in that silence, in that quiet understanding, they both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. But neither of them was quite ready to take the next step. Not yet. They both knew it was coming, though. It always was. The days following that night were filled with an unspoken promise that neither Alaric nor Lyra could ignore. The air between them was different, charged with a quiet anticipation that neither of them could fully articulate. They moved through the house as they always had, him working in his study, her attending to the various tasks she had always done. But everything felt tinged with something more, something deeper. Alaric couldn't shake the image of Lyra's smile, the way her eyes softened when she looked at him, or the warmth of her touch when their hands brushed. It had been a slow, deliberate exploration of each other's presence, a quiet unraveling of the walls they had both carefully built over time. They had crossed a threshold together, and though neither of them had fully acknowledged it, The unspoken truth was there, lingering in every shared glance and every passing moment. Lyra, too, was aware of the shift. She couldn't deny the way her heart raced when Alaric entered the room, the way her breath caught in her chest when he spoke her name. There was an undeniable connection between them, one that she hadn't anticipated when she had first come to this place as his servant. What had started as a relationship based on duty had, over time, transformed into something more. Something neither of them had fully understood at the time but had slowly allowed to blossom. One evening, as the sun began to set and cast long shadows across the room, Alaric found himself in his study once again, the papers before him blurred as his mind drifted elsewhere. He hadn't been able to focus on his work for days. The images of Lyra's face, her smile, and the way she made him feel distracting him from the task at hand. He couldn't deny it anymore. He wanted her, and not just in the way one might want a servant or a companion. No, this was something more, something deeper than anything he had ever felt before. He stood, stretching his stiff muscles, and walked to the window. The night had fallen, and the world outside was quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. His thoughts turned to Lyra once again. She had been in his life for so long, but now she seemed so much more, as if the bond they shared had grown stronger in ways neither of them could fully explain. It wasn't long before he found himself standing outside her door, his hand raised as if to knock, but hesitating at the last moment. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his mind was a whirlwind of uncertainty. What if she didn't feel the same way? What if he had read all of their interactions wrong? The last thing he wanted to do was put her in an uncomfortable position. Taking a deep breath, Alaric knocked softly on the door. He heard a faint rustling inside before the door opened, revealing Lyra standing in the doorway. She looked surprised to see him, but her expression quickly softened when she saw the look in his eyes. "Alaric?" she said, her voice gentle, her gaze flicking to his hand, which was still hovering near the doorframe. "Is everything all right?" He nodded slowly, his throat tight. I just wanted to talk. About us." Lyra's eyes widened slightly, and she stepped back, allowing him to enter. The soft glow of candlelight filled the room, casting long shadows across the furniture. She closed the door behind him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence stretching between them like an invisible thread. Finally, Lyra broke the silence. "What about us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alaric took a step forward, his heart beating wildly in his chest. "I don't know how to explain it," he admitted, "but I can't ignore it anymore. What's happening between us, the way we look at each other, the way I feel when you're near, it's different, and I don't want to pretend it's not." Lyra's gaze softened, and she took a small step toward him. "I feel it too," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "I've felt it for some time now, but I wasn't sure what it meant. I didn't want to make assumptions or overstep any boundaries. But now I'm not sure how to stop it." Alaric's chest tightened at her words, the vulnerability in her voice mirroring his own feelings. He reached out then, his hand trembling slightly as he brushed a lock of hair from her face. The gesture was gentle, tender, and the moment their skin touched, the world around them seemed to still. "I don't want to lose this," he murmured. "Whatever this is, I don't want to let go of it." Lyra's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, their gazes locked, and the room seemed to disappear. The only thing that mattered was the quiet understanding that passed between them. They didn't need to speak any further. The feelings were clear, etched into every glance and every touch. Slowly, she closed the distance between them, standing on tiptoe to place a soft kiss on his lips. It was tender, tentative, but it held a promise, a vow that whatever came next, they would face it together. When they pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, and they simply stood in the quiet warmth of the room. "I don't know where this is going," Lyra whispered, her voice filled with quiet certainty, "but I'm willing to find out." Alaric smiled softly, brushing his thumb against her cheek. "So am I," he replied. "As long as we're together, I'm willing to take that step." The weight of their words hung in the air, but there was no fear, no hesitation, only a sense of quiet contentment, the knowledge that they had both found something rare and precious in each other. They didn't know what the future held, but they were ready to discover it, one step at a time, side by side. As the fire in the hearth crackled softly, they stood there, together in the silence, knowing that this was only the beginning. Whatever came next, they would face it as equals, as partners, with hearts open and hands held tightly together. And in that moment, everything felt right.